Hi students, this is Mr. Eckert, and in this video clip we're going to look at the last two targets in this introductory section on cells. We're going to start with target C5, which says that you should be able to explain the difference between what's called prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells, and you should be able to give at least one example of each of those kinds of cells. So prokaryotes and eukaryotes make up two kinds of cells. If you put all the cells that exist in the world into a pot, you would divide them up into these two groups to start with, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Prokaryote cells on the left, you can see, are the simplest cells that exist. So all prokaryotes are all single-celled organisms, and they do not have any internal membrane-bound organelles. So you're not going to see mitochondria or endoplasmic reticulum, any of those organelles, with one exception, and that would be ribosomes. And you probably remember ribosomes, they make proteins. Proteins are the building blocks for all living things. So it does kind of make sense that prokaryotic cells would still have ribosomes because they're still going to need proteins. They pretty much are limited in their functions as a cell. So whereas eukaryotic cells, you've got muscle cells that provide movement, you've got nerve cells which carry impulses. Prokaryotic cells just pretty much have one function, and that be the life of that organism. Their DNA, unlike a eukaryotic cell, is circular. So it's connected, and when it's drawn, it's often drawn as almost, it looks like a rubber band that's been kind of folded over on itself. And there's only one example that you can come up with for a prokaryotic cell, because there's only one kind of organism that exists that's prokaryote, and that is bacteria. On the right, you see eukaryotic cells. And eukaryotes, they're much more complex. So if you see a drawing of a eukaryote cell, you're going to see all these organelles inside that we talked about earlier in targets 3 and 4. There's both multicellular eukaryotic organisms, and there are some unicellular eukaryotic organisms. The main organelle that you're going to see inside that you'll be able to identify right away, and if you see this, you know it's a eukaryotic cell, is the nucleus. So prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus. Again, they don't have any of those organelles except for ribosomes. But if you look at a drawing of a cell or a picture of a cell and you can see, oh, there's a nucleus, well, that must be a eukaryotic cell. And so, like we said earlier, they carry out various functions, muscle cells being movement, your skin cells being primarily protective, a protective function. The DNA in eukaryotic cells is more linear rather than circular. And of course, it's condensed into the form of chromosomes during a part of the cell that we'll learn about later called the cell cycle. And the DNA shape, yeah, I'm sure you've heard before, is a double helix. So any organism that you can name is a eukaryotic organism if it's not a bacterium. So we're talking plants, any animal, all fungi, any of those protozoans or protists, anything other than bacteria. So one way to help you maybe remember this is you carry it. So if you think about seeing your cells under the microscope, maybe your cheek cells, you'll remember seeing a nucleus. And any plant cells that we looked at, there was a nucleus. But eukaryote, so you and our cells are eukaryote. And maybe you'll remember, oh, yeah, my cell has a nucleus, and that'll help you to remember that you're eukaryote, and so are all other organisms other than bacteria. So on the test, I'll have a drawing or diagram of a cell. You'll be able to identify a eukaryote from a prokaryote, because again, you'll be able to see all those different organelles like you do here in this animal cell and here in this plant cell. As opposed to a prokaryotic cell, you don't see any nucleus. Here's the DNA, just kind of condensed in the middle. And then here's those ribosomes that we mentioned earlier. So if you see a very simple looking cell, only maybe a few ribosomes and what looks like DNA, then that's probably a prokaryotic cell. But if you see a lot of organelles, then that would definitely be a eukaryotic cell. All right, target C6 says that you should be able to describe a little bit about the history of our understanding of cells. And there are some people that stand out when we think about the history of cells, those being Hooke, Leeuwenhoek, Schwann, Schleiden, and Virchow. So Robert Hooke, we'll start with him. He was an English scientist who lived in the 1600s, and he was the first person to see cells at all. So he's credited with being the first person to see cells. This is an actual drawing that he made of what he saw through this rudimentary microscope, and he was looking at cork cells. Now cork comes from the bark, the inner bark of a tree, cork trees, and its inner bark, those cells are actually dead. So he drew those. It reminded him of these little cubicles that the monks at the times lived in, and those were called cells. So he coined the name cells and said that these were cells also. Anton van Leeuwenhoek, he was the first person to see living cells. So Hooke was the first person to see any cells at all. Those were dead cork cells. Leeuwenhoek is credited as the first person to see any living cells. Basically what he did is he went out and got some pond water and put a drop of pond water underneath a microscope, and he saw these things swimming around in the water, and he didn't know what they were. They looked like little tiny animals, so he called them animalcules, and actually they were little protozoans like paramecium and other kinds of protozoans that were swimming around in that water. And he saw bacteria as well. So he also was the first person to see, as you can see here, some muscle tissue, some muscle cells, sperm cells, and he saw blood flowing in little blood vessels. Matthias Schleiden, he was a botanist, so he studied plants in Germany, and he, as it says here, was a co-founder of the cell theory. So he said that all plants are made up of cells. Now, certainly, he probably didn't look at all plants underneath a microscope, but he looked at, maybe 10 plants. Wow, they're all made of cells. Looked at another 10 plants, and they were all made of cells, and maybe 10 more, and they were all made of cells. So after looking at quite a number of plants, he hypothesized that, well, I'll bet any plant that I put under the microscope is going to be made up of cells. And of course, he was right. Theodor Schwann was also a German scientist. He studied animals as opposed to plants, like Schleiden. And he also is a co-founder of the cell theory. If you put both of these together, all living things are made of cells. He was the first person to declare that all animals are made of cells. Now, I think if you look at his name, this will be easy for you to remember. Schwann is the guy who declared, he was the first to declare that all animals are made of cells. And if you look at his name, of course, Schwann sounds a lot like swan, and a swan's an animal. So that's how you're going to remember this. And the other guy that kind of sounds like this, Schleiden, well, he's the one who said that all plants were made of cells. Rudolf Virchow is our last scientist, and he was half Polish, half German, and he was a doctor. And he said he was the one who was the first to say that all cells come from pre-existing cells. So again, he's a co-founder of the cell theory. That was one of those three parts of the cell theory. All cells come from pre-existing cells.